Hey guys, tonight we're beginning with one of my favorite categories of things medieval people cared way too much about. Nuns. Specifically, what happened when nuns did the one thing they weren't supposed to do, break their vows. Now don't get me wrong, taking vows in a medieval convent wasn't exactly like signing up for Netflix where you can cancel any time. It was meant to be permanent, lifelong, eternal even. You vow chastity, obedience, and poverty. Basically, no sex, no independence, and no money. Congratulations, you've just enrolled in the hardest lifestyle subscription plan of the Middle Ages. But of course, humans are humans. People break rules, even the ones supposedly married to God. And medieval Europe, being medieval Europe, didn't just shrug about it. No, they turned nun rule breaking into a mix of scandal, punishment, and occasionally very awkward paperwork. So, tonight, as you're tucked in, maybe sipping tea, we're going to drift slowly through the world of convent life and what happened when the cloister gates didn't quite keep temptation or scandal out. Let's set the scene. Imagine a medieval convent. The stereotype is quiet stone walls, women in identical habits, everyone praying in perfect silence. In reality, not so much. These places could be noisy, political, even a little chaotic. Some were strict, others more like upscale boarding schools where noble daughters were parked when their families didn't know what else to do with them. So, what did these women vow? 3 main things. Chastity, no husbands, no lovers, no sneaky tavern flings. Obedience, you listen to your abbess, and by extension, the Pope. Poverty, you give up worldly goods, though let's be real, some convents were loaded with land and silverware. And if you broke these, well, let's just say the medieval church had a special talent for inventing rules about rules. Let's float first to the juiciest one, chastity. Because yes, some nuns did in fact end up in relationships. Some of those were consensual, some were coerced, and some were everything in between. But either way, if word got out, the punishments were creatively unpleasant. One of the most common? Being locked in your cell for years. Picture solitary confinement, but with prayers piped in instead of bad reality TV. In extreme cases, nuns who had full-on affairs or worse, had babies, could be literally bricked into their cells. Not symbolically, physically. A wall was built up, leaving a tiny hole for food and air, and congratulations, you're alive, but basically dead to the world. Nothing says merciful God quite like slow suffocation by boredom. Now, did that happen to everyone? Not really. Like most medieval punishments, it depended on who you were. Noblewoman? Probably a slap on the wrist and some very angry letters from the Pope to your dad. Poorer nun with no political family? Enjoy your permanent cell wall. But scandal went both ways. Sometimes it wasn't the nun sneaking out. It was priests sneaking in. Priests were technically supposed to be celibate too, which, let's just say, was about as effective as telling your cat not to shed on your black clothes. Records from across Europe show plenty of priests accused of seducing nuns, and in some convents it got so bad that bishops had to install literal grates, locks, and watchmen just to keep the visiting clergy from dropping by at suspicious hours. There's a famous case from the 14th century where an entire convent in Italy was accused of basically functioning like a medieval dating club. Nuns meeting men, letters being exchanged, the works. The bishop's solution? Replace the abbess with a stricter one and order daily inspections, which, if anything, probably just made everything more creative. Okay, let's shift to another vow, obedience. This one sounds dull, but ended up in some surprisingly dramatic situations. Nuns were expected to obey the abbess, who in turn answered to bishops and the pope. But abbesses weren't always gentle spiritual guides. Some were basically tyrants in veils. And if a nun resisted, you could be excommunicated, which, in the medieval imagination, was worse than death. No heaven, no community, no one was even allowed to eat dinner with you. Imagine getting ghosted by your entire town at once. One nun in 12th century France actually wrote a letter complaining that her abbess beat them, starved them, and stole their clothes to give to relatives. Obedience under that kind of leadership. Not exactly a heavenly calling. But since complaining was breaking obedience itself, the cycle kept spinning. Then, of course, we have poverty, the vow that was, shall we say, flexible. Technically, a nun wasn't supposed to own anything, but wealthy noble families sent their daughters to convents with hefty dowries, and those convents accumulated serious wealth. Some had better wine cellars than the local lords. So, breaking poverty didn't always mean hoarding treasure under your bed. Sometimes it just meant sneaking private luxuries, a little jewelry, a softer mattress, or, in one recorded case, a pet lapdog. Yes, one nun was scolded for worldly attachment because she adored her dog too much, which feels relatable. Who among us wouldn't rather pet a dog than sit through 3 hours of medieval chanting? Now, what about the ultimate scandal? Pregnancy. Because despite the veils, it happened. And when it did, the entire convent's reputation was at stake. Sometimes the nun was expelled quietly, sent back to her family in disgrace. Other times, the baby was taken and abandoned, or given to another household as a foundling. One of the darker cases came from Germany, where a nun who gave birth was literally executed, buried alive as punishment, which is horrifying but also shows how seriously the Church took the idea that nuns were the brides of Christ. Cheating on your husband is bad. Cheating on God, apparently fatal. But there are also stories with a bit more irony, like the case of a noble nun who became pregnant, and instead of punishment, her family just used money to quietly cover it up. She stayed in the convent, her child vanished into the world, and everyone went on chanting psalms as if nothing happened. Medieval justice, a sliding scale of how rich is your dad. Of course, not every nun who broke vows did it with romance or rebellion. Some just left, escaped convents entirely. Sometimes it was forced. Families stuffed girls into nunneries without asking, and they tried to run away. Other times, it was boredom. After all, if you're 16, locked in a convent with 30 older women and no TikTok, you might want to check out what the rest of the world has to offer. Escaped nuns were technically criminals. They could be hunted down, dragged back, and punished with, you guessed it, lifelong confinement. But a few actually succeeded. In the early 1500s, Martin Luther, the Reformation guy, helped several nuns escape a convent by smuggling them out in herring barrels. Yes, fish barrels. And yes, the smell must have been atrocious. But for them, it was freedom. Let's float for a moment into the daily life of nuns, because the stricter the schedule, the more tempting the rebellion. A typical day? Wake up absurdly early. Pray. Work. More prayer. A meal. More prayer. Study. Maybe some embroidery. And, you guessed it, more prayer. Repeat until death. Breaking that rhythm even a little was considered disobedience. Sneaking a nap, whispering jokes, writing letters without permission, There's even a surviving rule book scolding nuns for giggling during meals, which, honestly, feels harsh. If you can't laugh while choking down medieval porridge, what's the point of life? So, what happened, in summary, when nuns broke vows? It depended. Sometimes harsh punishment, sometimes hushed scandal, sometimes a suspiciously forgiving silence if noble families were involved. And the bigger picture here is this. Medieval convents were never just about faith. They were about politics, money, and control. Women who broke vows weren't just disobeying God. They were threatening the fragile order of families, reputations, and church authority, which is why punishments could swing from write extra prayers to welcome to your new life as a human brick ornament. Let's drift to another angle, because beyond scandals, nunneries were also one of the few places medieval women could actually read and write. That means we sometimes hear their voices. And what do they say? Well, a lot of them did believe deeply in their vows. They wrote about spiritual joy, divine visions, and holy love. But mixed in, there are hints of doubt, frustration, and quiet rebellion. One 15th century nun wrote a confessional poem about the sin of longing for worldly pleasures. Translation: she missed parties. Another wrote about how difficult it was to stay silent during meals because she wanted to share stories with her sisters. These tiny human details remind us the convent wasn't a world of robots. It was a world of real women, some faithful, some rebellious, some just trying to get through another endless day of chanting without dozing off. And with that gentle image, let's pause for a moment. Tonight, we've only just started peeling back the veil, pun fully intended, on what happened to medieval nuns who broke their vows. But there's more drifting ahead, because for every quiet scandal, there's a louder one. Entire convents accused of corruption, nuns who wielded shocking political power, abbesses who bent rules so hard they practically invented new ones. So, let's keep floating through history. And in part 2, we'll wander into those larger stories, the notorious convent scandals that shook kingdoms, and the women who managed to turn obedience into their own form of quiet rebellion. Welcome back. Hopefully by now you're relaxed, lights dimmed, maybe lying in bed, or on the couch pretending you'll just listen for 5 minutes before sleeping. Which, let's be honest, is exactly what I'd recommend for a 1.5-hour deep dive on medieval nuns. So far, we've looked at what happened when individual nuns broke vows, sneaking lovers, sneaking naps, or just sneaking out entirely. But tonight, let's float toward the bigger stories, entire convents, notorious scandals, and the abbesses who turned their cloisters into little kingdoms. Because if there's one thing medieval Europe was good at, it was corruption, especially when the people in charge were technically supposed to be holy. Let's start with one of my favorites, the convent of St. Clare in Pisa, 14th century. By reputation, this convent should have been filled with silent, obedient brides of Christ. Instead, documents describe it as a place of great noise and disorder, which is medieval bishop speak for absolute chaos. Nuns were accused of wandering the city in disguise. Some wore bright clothes instead of habits. There were rumors of secret banquets, forbidden wine, and, of course, men being let in. One bishop wrote that the convent resembled more of a tavern than a holy house, which honestly might have been more fun. The church's solution: crackdowns, threats of excommunication, attempts to replace leadership. But the fact we even have these records suggests the tavern nun energy kept going for quite some time. Another infamous one, the convent of Santa Lucia in Bologna. By the late 1400s, it had gained such a bad reputation for loose morals that locals openly called it a house of prostitution. Now, whether that was slander or partly true is debated. But even the Pope got involved, issuing letters about how to reform it. Imagine being so notorious that the Pope himself has to write, "Stop partying, ladies. God is watching." But the most telling thing is, these convents weren't shut down. They were reformed, which usually meant new abbesses installed, new rules, maybe a bishop swinging by more often. Because at the end of the day, convents were also valuable pieces of real estate, with land, income, and powerful patrons. You couldn't just close one. You had to make it work, even if the nuns inside were more into feasts than fasting. Now, scandals weren't always about sex or parties. Sometimes it was pure politics. Enter the world of power-hungry abbesses. An abbess was basically the CEO of a convent. She controlled the land, the finances, the staff, and the spiritual lives of dozens of women. In some cases, she even had vassals, peasants who owed rent to the convent, which means, yes, some abbesses wielded more power than the average knight. And if you think they were all saintly about it, think again. Take Agnes of Poitou, 11th century abbess of Quedlinburg. She wasn't just an abbess. She was also a political regent for the Holy Roman Empire. When the emperor died, she ruled in his place for her young son. Picture a nun running one of the largest empires in Europe, and people still expected her to act like a humble servant of God. Spoiler, she did not. Or look at Abbess Hildegard of Bingen. She's famous today as a mystic and composer. But she also ran her convent like a medieval boss lady. When local bishops tried to interfere, she wrote fiery letters scolding them, sometimes with lines that basically said, "Stop mansplaining God to me." Hildegard got away with it because she was brilliant, connected, and had a reputation for visions. Break vows. Number. Bend authority until bishops fumed? Absolutely. But not every abbess managed their power gracefully. Some abused it spectacularly. Records survive of abbesses hoarding wealth while starving their nuns. Others misuse convent funds to throw feasts for relatives. In one French case, an abbess was accused of selling church property to finance her brother's war, which admittedly sounds like something a sibling might guilt you into even today. The punishments? Often minimal. Because, again, politics mattered more than piety. If your family was powerful, the bishop might look the other way. If not, well, expect a papal investigation. Speaking of investigations, let's drift over to the visitation of convents. This was when a bishop or a papal official would show up unannounced to check on things. Imagine a surprise workplace inspection, but with eternal salvation at stake. What did they find? Oh, the usual: nuns hoarding luxuries, sneaking letters, refusing to do chores, and occasionally much more scandalous stuff. There are visitation records of nuns being caught with forbidden books of romance poetry, of nuns running side businesses, selling embroidered cloth without permission, and even of nuns keeping pet falcons, which frankly sounds amazing. But the inspectors didn't always punish harshly. Sometimes they just noted it down and told the abbess to fix it, which usually meant, "Please pretend to behave until I leave." Of course, not all scandals came from rebellion. Some convents were dumped with unwanted children of nobility. You'd think that would make them quieter. But in fact, stuffing unwilling teenagers into cloisters often created pressure cooker situations. One noblewoman in the 1200s tried to escape her convent repeatedly. Each time, her family dragged her back. Finally, she staged such a dramatic protest, refusing to eat, screaming during prayers, that the abbess begged her family to take her elsewhere, which to me proves that medieval discipline had limits. Sometimes sheer teenage angst outlasted holy authority. And here's a curious irony. While breaking vows was scandalous, some nuns were celebrated for pushing the limits of chastity in interesting ways. For example, mystics often wrote about being married to Christ in strangely romantic, even erotic language. One nun described visions of Christ kissing her. Another described being embraced in a mystical union. For the Church, this was fine, because technically it was spiritual, not physical. But you can imagine how blurred the lines felt in practice. A nun having visions of heavenly romance might be praised as a saint, while another caught holding hands with a local priest could be punished severely. Medieval logic, inconsistent as ever. Let's float now to the Reformation, because when Martin Luther and friends came along, convent scandals suddenly had political use. Protestants loved pointing to misbehaving nuns as proof that Catholicism was corrupt. Pamphlets described convents as dens of vice. Stories circulated, some true, many exaggerated, about nuns breaking chastity, priests sneaking in, and abbesses swimming in wealth. Were all convents like this? Number. Many were quiet, devout, and honestly kind of boring. But the scandalous ones made better headlines. And once printing presses got involved, the reputation of bad nuns spread faster than ever. Now, let's not forget the human side. For the women inside, scandals weren't always about lust or greed. Sometimes they were just about survival. A nun might break obedience because her abbess was cruel. She might keep private money because she feared poverty. She might seek love because, well, she was human. One of my favorite small stories comes from a 15th century nun who admitted in confession that she sometimes faked illnesses to skip prayers. And honestly, that feels deeply relatable. Centuries may pass, but pretending to be sick to get out of obligations is eternal. So, what's the big picture of convent scandals? They weren't outliers. They were part of the messy reality of medieval life. Rules were strict, but enforcement was uneven. Nuns were expected to be angels, but they were still people with tempers, desires, and occasional lapses into falcon keeping. And maybe that's why these stories fascinate us today. Because behind the veils and vows, we see very familiar struggles. Authority versus rebellion. Duty versus desire. Spiritual ideals versus human reality. All right, let's slowly drift forward. We've talked about individuals breaking vows and whole convents sliding into chaos. But there's one more layer. What happened when the outside world intruded? Because sometimes nuns broke vows not because they wanted to, but because kings, nobles, and even armies barged in and forced them to. And those stories take us into some of the darkest corners of medieval history. So, in Part 3, we'll float into that uncomfortable territory. How convents became targets during wars, how powerful men treated them, and how nuns navigated survival in a world where even the cloister walls couldn't always protect them. Welcome back. Still awake? Or at least half awake? Which is exactly the right mood for this. So far, we've been inside the cloister, peeking at scandals, falcons, and abbesses who thought poverty vows were optional. But the story of medieval nuns isn't just about what they did inside convent walls. It's also about what happened when the outside world barged in. because as much as cloisters were supposed to be a safe little bubble sealed off from worldly chaos, reality had other ideas. Wars, politics, and power struggles had a way of smashing down the doors, sometimes literally. Let's start with warfare. Medieval Europe had plenty of it, and armies, as you might imagine, weren't famous for respecting convent boundaries. Convents were often looted, burned, or occupied. Sometimes nuns fled before soldiers arrived, abandoning everything. Other times, they stayed, hoping God, or at least the abbess's connections, would keep them safe. Occasionally, rulers promised protection, but soldiers on campaign weren't known for reading the fine print of papal bulls. One chilling example comes from the 100 Years' War. French and English armies trampled back and forth across the countryside, and convents in contested regions were frequent casualties. Chronicles record nuns hiding sacred relics, scattering into villages, or being forced to receive soldiers as guests, which sounds polite on paper, but usually wasn't. And it wasn't just random looting. Sometimes convents were deliberate targets, especially if they were wealthy. Remember, some of these houses owned vineyards, farmland, even mills. Taking over a convent wasn't just sacrilege, it was a quick way to seize income. In one German case, rival nobles literally fought over which family got to control a particular abbey. The nuns inside? Pawns in a feud, written about more like property than people. Their vows didn't protect them from being dragged into dynastic squabbles. Even in peacetime, the outside world crept in through noble patronage. Families didn't just send their daughters to convents, they often tried to control them afterward. Abbess positions were hot commodities. A powerful family might maneuver to get their relative elected abbess, effectively turning the convent into a family estate. This created some awkward contradictions. Imagine being a nun told to embrace poverty while your abbess is feasting with cousins in the guest hall. Not exactly the spiritual atmosphere the rule book intended, but again, the church tolerated it because politics. A convent tied to a great noble family was a useful ally. As long as the scandals didn't get too loud, everyone looked the other way. Now, there's another darker reality. Sometimes convents were invaded not for wealth, but for control over women themselves. During wars, chronicles occasionally describe nuns suffering violence at the hands of soldiers. It's rarely written about directly. Medieval chroniclers had a habit of using euphemisms like dishonored or violated. But between the lines, the meaning is clear. Convent walls weren't impenetrable, and vows weren't always respected by men with swords. When that happened, the church often responded not by punishing the attackers, but by punishing the women. Nuns who were assaulted sometimes faced suspicion, accusations of breaking vows, or pressure to do penance as if it were their fault, which is both tragic and maddening, though very on-brand for medieval double standards. Let's float away from the battlefield, though, into something slightly less grim, but still intrusive. Royal politics. Kings and queens often use convents as retirement homes for inconvenient relatives. Have a widowed queen, send her to a convent. An unruly princess, convent. A sister of the king who might threaten succession if she marries the wrong man. Yes, convent again. This meant convents occasionally housed women of immense power and prestige, who weren't always thrilled to be there. Some caused trouble simply by existing. Imagine a convent full of ordinary nuns, and suddenly the dowager queen shows up with her servants, her jewels, and her opinions about everything. Harmony? Not likely. In one case, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Yes, that Eleanor was confined to a convent for a while after rebelling against her husband, King Henry II of England. Technically, she was under house arrest in a convent, which just goes to show even queens could end up behind cloister walls if politics demanded it. Sometimes convents also doubled as political prisons, when male rulers wanted to neutralize a woman without outright executing her. Sending her to a convent was the respectable option. It looked merciful. It also removed her from the marriage market and effectively erased her from political life. This happened to various noblewomen across Europe, duchesses, princesses, even rivals to the throne. Some submitted quietly, others less so. One noblewoman wrote bitter letters complaining that her holy confinement was nothing but a gilded cage, which she wasn't wrong. But convents weren't just prisons. They were also stage sets for dynastic theater. For example, when a king wanted to look pious, he might make a show of donating land to a convent, or parading his daughter in to take vows. These ceremonies could be grand, with choirs, nobles, and feasts. Behind the pageantry, though, it was usually about politics, consolidating land, neutralizing rivals, or flaunting royal generosity. Nuns, in these cases, were both the actors and the props. They had to sing, smile, and embody the role of holy brides, even if they were quietly fuming about losing family wealth or freedom. Now, not all outside intrusions were hostile. Sometimes convents became centers of diplomacy. Abbesses from major houses occasionally hosted kings, princes, or bishops. Convents could be safe, neutral ground for negotiations. In fact, some abbesses wielded enough influence that rulers actively courted their favor. Being an abbess of a major imperial abbey wasn't just a religious role, it was a power seat. Imagine a woman who technically had no husband, but still had enough land, wealth, and vassals that local nobles had to bow to her. That kind of power made abbesses both respected and resented. And then there's the cultural intrusion: art, music, and letters. Remember Hildegard of Bingen from earlier? She wasn't alone. Convents produced poetry, plays, illuminated manuscripts, even medical treatises. These works often traveled outside the walls, carried by patrons or copied for wider use. But here's the twist. Some of these writings critiqued the very world that tried to control them. Nuns composed letters calling out corruption, bishops, or even popes. They couched it in religious language, but the underlying message was, "Stop messing with us," which is a surprisingly bold note of defiance, considering they were supposedly cloistered and silent. Of course, sometimes the outside world came crashing in through plague. During the Black Death, many convents lost huge numbers of sisters. Some convents closed entirely. Others took in girls more quickly, even without full training, just to keep numbers up. The idea of strict vows blurred when survival itself was at stake. Bishops sometimes gave emergency permissions to bend the rules: fewer prayers, looser fasting, more practical chores. In moments like these, convent life revealed its fragility. One outbreak could wipe away decades of stability. And breaking vows wasn't about scandal, it was about survival. So, what do we see when we let the outside world in? Convents weren't bubbles floating above history. They were woven right into it. They were raided in wars, manipulated by kings, stuffed with noble inmates, and occasionally turned into cultural hubs. Nuns might try to cling to vows, but politics, swords, and disease had other plans. And when vows were broken under these pressures, the response was often less about God and more about power. Was the nun wealthy? Was her family influential? Was the convent strategically useful? Those questions mattered more than any whispered prayers in the chapel. As we keep drifting, let's notice something. The story of medieval nuns is both deeply human and deeply ironic. They were supposed to renounce the world, and yet the world refused to leave them alone. And in Part 4, we'll wander into an even more personal side, the weird daily habits, small rebellions, and the occasional bizarre miracle stories that convent records preserve. Because sometimes breaking vows wasn't about scandal or politics. Sometimes it was about sneaking cheese into the dormitory or claiming you had a vision just to get out of chores. But that's for the next chapter of our sleepy stroll. Welcome back again. At this point, if you're still awake, congratulations. You might be one of the few people in history who can listen to 4 hours of medieval nun gossip without nodding off, which, honestly, makes you more resilient than most of the nuns themselves during matins at 3 in the morning. So far, we've drifted through scandals, power games, and the way outside politics crashed into cloisters. But tonight, let's take it slower. Let's step inside the convent again and just look at the tiny everyday rebellions, the weird habits, the quiet human moments that broke vows not dramatically, but in ways that feel surprisingly familiar. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that even the holiest lives had loopholes. Let's start with the simplest rebellion of all: food. Medieval convents were supposed to follow strict fasting rules. Certain days meant no meat. Lent meant going basically vegan before veganism had a catchy name. Meals were plain: porridge, bread, maybe beans if you were lucky. But convent records are full of complaints about nuns sneaking in treats. One visitation report scolds sisters for keeping secret supplies of cheese in their dormitory. Another mentions wine hidden under beds, which means, yes, contraband snacking existed centuries before modern college dorms. There's even a story from a French convent where the abbess had to confiscate a delivery of luxury fish, because the nuns were ordering delicacies from the local market during fast days. Imagine your superior catching your Uber Eats order and banning sushi deliveries for the whole house. Then there's the issue of sleep. The rule was, wake up in the middle of the night for prayers. Matins. Because nothing says spiritual devotion like dragging yourself out of bed at 2 a.m. to chant psalms by candlelight. But unsurprisingly, some nuns did not comply with enthusiasm. Visitation notes mention sisters lingering in bed, pretending to be ill, or arriving late and yawning. In one case, an abbess accused her nuns of outright snoring through prayers, which paints a much more relatable picture than the silent, disciplined choir you might imagine. And of course, some just skipped. They hid in corners or claimed headaches, which, to be fair, probably fooled no one. But what could the abbess do? Punish them with more prayers? That's like disciplining a kid by giving them extra math homework. Let's float over to fashion. Technically, nuns wore the habit, plain, modest, identical. But even within that uniform, women found ways to bend the rules. Some added colored ribbons, others wore softer fabrics. There are even complaints about nuns tailoring their veils in flattering ways. One bishop scolded a convent where the sisters were wearing sleeves too wide and luxurious, which makes you wonder, did he expect runway models to critique them? And then, of course, there's the infamous issue of shoes. Simple leather sandals were standard, but some nuns splurged on fancy boots, embroidered slippers, even fur-lined footwear. Poverty vow or not, Cold toes apparently justified a little indulgence. Another small rebellion? Music. Chanting was required, but only plain chant. Anything too fancy was frowned upon, which naturally made some nuns experiment with harmonies, little flourishes, even sneaking in popular tunes. A visitation record from Spain scolds nuns for singing light songs of the world in the cloister. Translation: they were humming catchy secular tunes when they should have been reciting psalms. Imagine walking past a convent wall and hearing nuns trying out the medieval equivalent of pop music. Not exactly top 40 radio, but definitely not approved by the bishop. Let's pause at something stranger: pets. Technically, the vow of poverty and rules of silence discouraged keeping animals, but humans are humans, and medieval nuns adored pets. Cats were common. They kept down mice and doubled as companions. Some convents tolerated dogs. Others forbade them, which of course made some sisters sneak them in anyway. One nun in England got in trouble for spending too much time with her lapdog. The official record says she showed inordinate affection to the animal, which sounds like she just loved her pup a bit too obviously. Personally, I'd side with the dog. There are also scattered mentions of birds, like pet songbirds, and that one falcon we talked about earlier. Nothing says cloistered devotion like walking into chapel with a hawk on your arm. Of course, vows weren't only broken through indulgence. Sometimes they were stretched by creativity. Take the vow of silence. Some orders demanded long periods without talking. But nuns weren't exactly mute. They developed sign languages, simple hand signals for food, chores, or gossip. In some convents, silence became less about holiness and more about a game of charades. And yes, gossip still found its way through. Letters were technically forbidden without abbess approval, but plenty were smuggled in and out. Noble nuns especially had contacts, and they weren't about to let a little vow stop them from writing to cousins at court. Let's wander now into miracle stories, because convent chronicles didn't just record scandals. They also wrote down visions, divine signs, and holy wonders. Sometimes these were genuine spiritual experiences. Other times, you get the sense they were convenient excuses. A nun faints during long prayers? Must be an ecstatic vision. A nun skips meals but sneaks bread at night? Clearly, she survives on divine nourishment. A nun refuses chores? Oh, she's too holy, caught up in heavenly contemplation. In other words, some miracles may have been clever loopholes. After all, if people believed you were touched by a god, they weren't going to punish you for skipping sweeping duty. One famous case, a nun claimed the Virgin Mary visited her and told her she didn't need to fast anymore. Convenient. Another swore she saw angels every time she dozed off during matins. Sleepy or spiritual? Hard to say. But either way, her sisters recorded it as holy. Miracles gave nuns a kind of untouchable authority. If the abbess said, "Stop slacking," a nun could claim, "Oh no, I wasn't slacking. I was in divine ecstasy." Try arguing with that. There's also the matter of friendships. Officially, all sisters were supposed to love each other equally, without favoritism. But convent records repeatedly scold nuns for forming close bonds, what they called particular friendships. Bishops worried these bonds might distract from devotion or lead to forbidden intimacy. But realistically, it was human connection. Women living together for decades were bound to form attachments. Some wrote letters to each other, exchanged little gifts, or supported each other against stricter abbesses. And while the church frowned on it, These friendships were probably what made convent life bearable. Sometimes, of course, friendships slid into something more. Medieval Europe did not openly discuss same-sex relationships, but hints exist in convent records. Abbesses worrying about improper closeness, or confessors noting nuns who shared a bed. Whether these were romantic, sexual, or just affectionate is impossible to know, but the anxiety around them shows that convent walls couldn't erase human desire. And then we have creative punishments. When nuns were caught breaking rules, abbesses had options. The harshest punishments were confinement, excommunication, or in extreme scandals, expulsion. But for smaller slip-ups, convents invented wonderfully petty penalties. A late medieval record mentions nuns forced to eat on the floor instead of at the table for minor disobedience. Others were ordered to wear uncomfortable clothes. One abbess made talkative nuns carry heavy stones as a reminder to keep their mouths shut. Subtlety was not the medieval strong suit. And, of course, the most common punishment? More prayers. If you skipped matins, you might be ordered to chant an extra 200 psalms, which probably didn't reduce yawning, but at least it kept discipline technically intact. What do all these little details show us? That breaking vows wasn't always about dramatic scandal. More often, it was about everyday life colliding with unrealistic rules. You can't lock dozens of human beings together and expect them to live like angels. So they found loopholes. They bent the rules. They smuggled cheese, petted dogs, sang popular songs, and occasionally pretended visions excused them from chores. And honestly, that feels more human and more revealing than all the official scandals put together. So, as we drift out of this section, picture convent life not as endless grim silence, but as a mix of prayer, boredom, and small rebellions. The occasional scandalous affair existed, sure, but most vow-breaking was just nuns being people, tired, hungry, lonely, mischievous. And in Part 5, we'll keep floating along this thread by looking at what happened when convent life ended, because vows were supposed to last a lifetime. But what about nuns who left, who were expelled, or who tried to return to normal life? Their stories are some of the strangest of all. If you've stayed with me this far, you deserve a medal, or at least a candle and a comfortable bench in some echoing stone chapel. Tonight, we turn from the small rebellions inside convent walls to the dramatic exits. Because while most nuns stayed in their cloisters until death, some didn't. Some left willingly. Some were forced out. And some fled like characters in a midnight adventure tale. The vow was supposed to be for life. Once you were enclosed, you weren't meant to leave. But vows are paper promises when weighed against hunger, politics, or desire. And so we find nuns escaping into the world, sometimes with scandal, sometimes with silence. The runaways. Let's start with the dramatic ones, the escapes. Picture the scene. High convent walls, locked gates, a world outside filled with temptation and danger. And yet, records show nuns literally climbing over walls, bribing gatekeepers, or disguising themselves to sneak out. In 1318, a nun in England was caught because she escaped in men's clothing. She shaved her head, put on a tunic, and tried to vanish into the world. But she was recognized and dragged back. The chronicler doesn't bother to tell us her name, just that she sinned greatly. But behind that judgment, you can hear the story of a woman desperate enough to risk everything for freedom. Other cases are less dramatic, but just as bold. Some nuns slipped out to visit lovers, others to attend feasts, others simply to see family. And while some returned voluntarily, others vanished. For every nun caught and recorded, there may have been others who melted into the countryside and never looked back. Expulsion. Not every departure was voluntary. Some women were expelled. If a nun broke vows too often or too publicly, the abbess, bishop, or even higher authorities could remove her. Expulsion was rare because it brought shame to the convent and raised messy legal questions about where the expelled woman was supposed to go. But it happened. Some expelled nuns ended up living with relatives, treated as embarrassing family burdens. Others entered secular households as servants or governesses. A few, notorious enough, drifted into lives of scandal, becoming mistresses or simply vanishing into the streets. The records are often harsh, but between the lines you can feel the sadness. Imagine spending decades in a convent, then being cast out with no training for the outside world, no money, and a ruined reputation. Some of these women likely ended in poverty. The return to family. Not all departures were scandalous. Some nuns were allowed to leave for practical reasons, especially if their families pulled strings. A noble woman might withdraw from convent life if her relatives decided to marry her off instead. Technically, this violated her vows, but politics trumped piety. Kings and bishops could issue dispensations, wiping vows away like chalk on a board. There are letters from noble families begging popes for releases, arguing that their daughters had been too young or forced into convents. Sometimes the pope agreed, freeing the woman to marry. Other times, the answer was a stern no, and the nun remained enclosed against her will. For wealthier families, though, loopholes existed. Gold could smooth over vows surprisingly well. The halfway lives, some departures weren't total. A curious category existed, women who lived half in, half out. They might technically remain nuns, but with special permissions to live at home, manage estates, or travel. In some cases, these were abbesses wielding vast power. In others, they were women who negotiated a softer form of religious life. One record tells of a nun who spent years outside the cloister managing her family's business, while still technically bound by vows. Another mentions women who lived in secular clothing, but under the label of religious. These blurred cases show how porous the boundaries could be. The scandalous returns, and then there were the cases that shocked chroniclers. Women who left convents and plunged into scandal. In late medieval Germany, for example, city records mention former nuns who became courtesans. The combination was so notorious that the phrase runaway nun became shorthand for fallen women. Playwrights and poets mocked them, weaving them into bawdy tales. One infamous figure was Katharina von Bora, better known as Martin Luther's wife. She and a group of fellow nuns famously escaped their convent in barrels of herring, smuggled out by sympathizers. She didn't become a courtesan, she became a reformer's partner. But her story fed both admiration and outrage. The runaway nun who turned Protestant housewife. Not every ex-nun found such stability. For many, leaving meant poverty, stigma, or danger. But their very existence shows how vows could be broken in the most final way, not just bending rules, but walking out of the cloister forever. Death outside the walls. The saddest stories are of women who left without permission and found no safe ground. Records mention nuns dying in childbirth after escaping with lovers. Others were found wandering, homeless, in cities. Some were dragged back to convents posthumously, their bodies buried within walls despite their broken vows, because even in death, families wanted to erase the shame. In some places, church law even debated whether runaway nuns could be buried in consecrated ground. The answer varied. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, which meant your eternal rest might depend on how forgiving your bishop was, why they left stepping back, what drove nuns to leave. Desire, love affairs, sometimes with priests, sometimes with laymen, sometimes with fellow nuns. Oppression, harsh abbesses, cruel rules, or simply boredom. Family pressure, families reclaiming their daughters for marriage or politics. Faith itself. Some women became disillusioned, especially in the years leading up to the Reformation, when corruption within convents grew more visible. Each departure was a quiet rebellion against a system that promised spiritual devotion, but often delivered monotony, hunger, or captivity. The Church's response. How did the Church respond? With mixed strategies. Sometimes it punished harshly, public penance, confinement, or even imprisonment. Other times it quietly looked away, especially for wealthy families. And after the Protestant Reformation, whole convents dissolved, turning nuns loose in the world with little preparation. Some adapted, some struggled. What strikes me most is how human it all feels. We often imagine medieval religion as ironclad, but even here, vows could be bent, broken, or revoked. And behind every expelled nun or runaway sister in the records was a woman making a choice, sometimes desperate, sometimes joyful, always costly. The fate of broken vows. So what happened to those who left? Some found new lives as wives, mothers, businesswomen. Some sank into poverty. Some became symbols, mocked in plays, whispered about in sermons. A few became legends, like Luther's wife, whose escape changed history. And many? They disappeared into silence. Their names are missing from records. Their stories were erased by shame or indifference. But the fact that we glimpse them at all, climbing walls, smuggling letters, defying abbesses, reminds us that medieval women weren't passive figures locked forever behind convent walls. They resisted, they escaped, and sometimes they won. Drifting toward the end, as we close this part, I want you to imagine again the convent at night, the gates locked, the bells silent, and somewhere, maybe, a woman pressing her hands against the cold stone, dreaming of a world beyond. Some would never step outside, some would, and those who did left traces in records that shock us with their raw humanity. Because vows can bind a body, but they rarely bind the restless human heart. If you've ever passed by a monastery ruin, maybe you felt that strange tension. Silence and holiness on one hand, whispers of scandal on the other. That tension isn't new. Medieval people themselves felt it. For most villagers, nuns were both sacred figures and sources of gossip. A nun breaking her vows was at once shocking, amusing, and sometimes even expected. Tonight, let's wander through the dusty roads and candle-lit halls of medieval Europe and see how outsiders viewed these women when their devotion cracked. Villagers, awe and whisper. To the average villager, the convent was mysterious. It loomed on the edge of town like a castle, but instead of soldiers, it housed women bound to prayer. When nuns kept their vows, people saw them as holy intercessors. They prayed for crops, for babies, for the sick. Donations flowed in. Families felt proud to have a daughter inside. But when news spread of a vow broken, the mood shifted. Gossip bloomed like wildfire. Villagers whispered about a nun caught sneaking to a lover's bed, or an abbess rumored to drink fine wine while peasants starved. Mockery sometimes followed. Popular jokes and folk songs poked fun at sinful sisters. One English ballad even jokes about a nun's secret affair producing a baby with no father to be found. Fear also lingered. People believed a nun who broke vows could bring curses, storms, or divine wrath on the whole village. So, for common folk, nuns were both admired and watched with suspicious curiosity. A vow broken was entertainment, but also a threat to cosmic order. Nobles, politics over piety. For nobles, convents weren't just holy places, they were tools. Daughters could be stored in convents if no good marriage appeared. Younger sisters could take vows to preserve inheritance for older brothers. Widows could retire there to avoid remarriage. So what happened when vows broke? Nobles often cared less about morality than about family reputation and property. If a noble daughter ran away from her convent to marry, families sometimes pushed for forgiveness or covered it up. Wealthy houses could write to bishops or even popes asking for dispensation. Gold and influence often smoothed the scandal. But when the vow breaker was poor, or when family honor was stained beyond repair, families disowned daughters. Sometimes they arranged for public penance, forcing the woman to kneel barefoot, confess, and be whipped before the townsfolk. To nobles, broken vows were less about God, more about embarrassment and leverage. The church, anger and damage control. The church itself had a complicated reaction. On paper, vows were sacred. Breaking them was a grave sin, a betrayal of Christ. Councils thundered against it. Bishops issued stern decrees. But in practice, the church often responded with damage control. Why? Because convents needed good reputations to survive. Donations and prestige depended on the idea that enclosed women were pure, holy, untouchable. Scandal threatened the whole system, so bishops might quietly hush cases, moving guilty nuns to other houses, or writing vague reports that discipline was administered. Only when scandals grew too loud, say, when an entire convent was known for drunkenness or affairs, did the church crack down hard, and when they did, the punishments could be fierce, locking women in cells, public penance in front of their community, in extreme cases, imprisonment for life. Still, the church's real fear wasn't the sin itself. It was loss of credibility. A single runaway nun could be explained away, but a convent full of rumors, that could undermine the entire image of holiness. Poets, jesters, and mockery. If villagers whispered, poets shouted. Medieval literature loved mocking nuns who broke vows. Satirical poems described them sneaking lovers into convents or feasting on luxuries instead of fasting. Jesters at noble courts spun bawdy tales of holy sisters who weren't so holy after all. Even Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, gives us a prioress more obsessed with manners and tiny dogs than prayer, a sly wink at the gap between the ideal and the real. Plays performed in town squares sometimes showed corrupt abbesses or wayward nuns as comic relief. The crowd laughed, but behind the humor was unease. These stories worked because everyone knew, at least vaguely, that scandals were real. Protestants, runaway nuns as propaganda. When the Protestant Reformation exploded in the 1500s, vow-breaking nuns became symbols. Martin Luther himself helped smuggle nuns out of convents, most famously Katharina von Bora, who became his wife. To Protestants, runaway nuns were proof that vows were unnatural and oppressive. They printed pamphlets celebrating these women as brave escapees from corruption. Meanwhile, Catholics accused them of disgrace, calling them fallen brides of Christ. The same woman could be seen as a heroine or a whore, depending on which side of the religious fence you stood. So vow-breaking nuns weren't just personal tragedies or scandals. They were weapons in a cultural war. Legends and ghosts, beyond politics and gossip, there were also legends. Tales circulated of nuns punished by God for their sins. One story tells of a nun who abandoned her vows for a lover, only to be swallowed by the earth. Another tells of a runaway sister who returned to the convent years later, only to find time had stood still, her community still praying as if she'd never left. Ghost stories, too, emerged. Villagers whispered of white ladies, wandering spirits of vow-breakers doomed to roam forever. In folklore, a nun's broken vow didn't just stain her, it echoed into the afterlife. The weight of shame. The common thread in all these reactions was shame. For villagers, it was communal shame. For nobles, family shame. For the church, institutional shame. The woman herself, she often bore the full burden. Her broken vow marked her like a scar, visible long after the act. Some rebuilt lives as wives or workers, others carried the shame into poverty and obscurity. And yet, the fact that so many stories, songs, jokes, and legends exist tells us something. Vow-breaking fascinated people. It was a mix of horror and thrill, like watching a taboo crumble. Why the world cared. So why did outsiders care so much about what nuns did inside cloisters? Because convents weren't just religious. They were symbols of order. If nuns, supposedly married to Christ, could fall, what did that say about the rest of society? A runaway nun wasn't just a woman leaving a convent. She was a crack in the great wall of medieval order, a reminder that vows, rules, and institutions could all break under human desire, drifting toward the end. So picture it, a village at dusk. A bell tolls from the convent. Villagers cross themselves, whispering prayers. But in the alehouse, someone laughs at a bawdy joke about a nun. In the castle, a nobleman writes to a bishop, smoothing over a daughter's scandal. And in some dusty scriptorium, a monk quietly notes the case of a sister fallen into sin, while deciding how much to tell and how much to hide. This was the world outside the walls, admiring, mocking, scandalized, and always watching, because the cloister may have been enclosed, but its walls were never thick enough to keep out the gaze of the world. History is never just about what happened. It's also about what people imagine happened. When it came to nuns who broke vows, the imagination was endless. Even after convent walls grew quieter, the image of the fallen sister haunted paintings, poems, plays, and whispers for centuries. It seeped into Gothic novels, lingered in ghost legends, and even shaped how we picture sin and temptation today. Tonight, let's follow the ghost of the vow-breaking nun across time. Medieval memory, the sin that wouldn't fade. Long after a scandal ended, stories lived on. Medieval scribes sometimes recorded tales of vow-breaking with a moral twist. A nun who fled her convent might appear in a chronicle as a warning example. These stories worked like sermons. Do not be like her, or God will punish you too. But memory wasn't always harsh. In some miracle tales, fallen nuns repented and were saved by Mary's mercy. The Virgin was seen as a spiritual mother who could forgive even broken brides of Christ. So even in medieval memory, vow-breakers lived between condemnation and redemption. Renaissance and Baroque, the sensual nun. By the Renaissance, artists and writers took a new interest in the forbidden, and the figure of the sensual vow-breaking nun became a cultural obsession. Paintings sometimes hinted at secret sins within cloisters, showing richly dressed nuns, more noblewoman than ascetic. Literature grew bolder. Italian tales and Spanish plays told stories of abbesses with lovers or novices tricked into sin. These weren't just moral warnings. They were also titillating entertainments. Poets used the nun as a symbol of desire, battling against duty. The cloistered woman became the perfect metaphor for temptation breaking chains. It was as if the vow-breaking nun embodied the very tension of the Renaissance: restraint versus freedom, duty versus passion. The Gothic nun, from scandal to horror. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe fell in love with the Gothic. Haunted castles, stormy skies, ancient sins rising from the grave. And in this world, the vow-breaking nun became a classic figure. The most famous? Matthew Lewis's 1796 novel, The Monk. Here, a nun named Agnes hides a forbidden pregnancy inside the convent. The result is terror, confinement, madness, and death. Readers were shocked and thrilled. Gothic tales often painted nuns as either victims, innocent women trapped in cruel convents, punished for natural desires; villains, sinful nuns indulging in lust, deceit, or even witchcraft. The broken vow wasn't just a scandal anymore, it was a stage for horror. Folklore, ghost, nuns in white. In village folklore, vow-breaking nuns became spirits. The White Lady ghost often traced back to a nun who left her vows. In countless European legends, she roams ruins or lonely fields, weeping for sins or searching for a lost lover. In France, some White Lady legends explicitly describe them as runaway nuns. In Ireland, ruined abbeys are said to echo with the steps of nuns who sinned. In Mexico, the famous La Llorona, the weeping woman, sometimes merges with older tales of guilty sisters. The ghost nun became a way to explain ruins, tragedies, or simply the feeling that sacred spaces held secrets. The stage and the scandal. In the 18th and 19th centuries, stages across Europe and America loved to show fallen nuns. Opera and theater portrayed abbesses in love, novices caught in webs of temptation, or cloisters turned into prisons of desire. These plays thrilled audiences by mixing religion, sex, and scandal, the forbidden cocktail of the age. Censorship often tried to block them, but that only made people more curious. The nun who broke vows had become a public fantasy, modern horror, and pop culture. Even today, echoes remain. Horror films often draw on the vow-breaking nun image. Think of the terrifying nun in the Conjuring universe. Though more demon than human, she comes from that old idea of corrupted holiness. Novels and dramas still use the nun's vow as a symbol of purity under siege. A vow broken becomes a shorthand for taboo. Pop culture jokes sometimes still circle around the naughty nun trope, descendants of medieval satire. The vow-breaking nun, once a real medieval scandal, has become a timeless archetype. Why the image survives. But why does this figure keep coming back, century after century? Because she is the perfect contradiction. A nun symbolizes purity, holiness, untouchable devotion. A vow-breaker symbolizes desire, rebellion, the human refusing to stay chained. Put together, you get a figure that is both sacred and scandalous. People can't look away. In her we see both the thing society demands, discipline, order, obedience, and the thing humans always are, messy, passionate, flawed. That contradiction doesn't die. It keeps haunting us, from medieval ballads to Netflix horror shows. The Last Bell. So picture it one final time. A ruined convent stands under a silver moon. The walls are broken, the windows empty. Somewhere inside, a bell that hasn't rung in centuries seems to echo in the wind. People pass by, whispering stories of sisters who fled, of abbesses who sinned, of ghosts who still wander. The vow-breaking nun is gone, but not gone. She lives on in memory, in art, in laughter, in nightmares. Because once a vow was broken, it could never truly be sealed again.